Okay, let's see. Hello, everyone. This is Ed Weiser, Reef Weiser with at the Reef to Reef Forum. And today our special guest is Bobby Miller, who is Humblefish on the Reef to Reef Forum. Hello, Bobby.
Hi, Ed.
How you doing today?
I'm pretty good. I'm doing really well.
How did you get interested in fish health? That's such an interesting topic. What started you getting involved in that part of the hobby?
Well, I've been in the hobby for a long time, since I was a kid, and but about 5 or 6 years ago, it was actually a 57-gallon Illuminati setup, and every single fish I put in this tank died. I mean, they lasted maybe 2 to 4 weeks. They died, and I had kind of gone back and forth in my life between, sometimes I quarantine, sometimes I just practice ick management. But first time ever, I just could not keep fish alive. And, there were no visible symptoms. I was racking my brain trying to figure out what happened. And it really bothered me. Probably for the first time ever, I actually considered just walking away from the hobby, because I just felt defeated, because I couldn't keep fish alive. So, but instead of doing that, I started doing a lot of research, a lot of reading, and I eventually figured out that these fish were dying due to gill flukes, which gill flukes, mostly you don't see any visible symptoms. The worms are inside their gills. So I learned for the first time 5, 6 years ago about gill flukes, and that just kind of like got it going for me. And next thing I knew, I'm reading books, I'm on the forums, I'm spending like all day on Google Scholar, like just doing as much research as I possibly could about fish diseases, and it just took off from there.
That's sometimes it's just something that clicks with you on a different topic. And there's so many different aspects of the marine hobby that one can get involved in, and it's a very interesting way of barreling into a topic that you got there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had to kind of get kicked in the butt a little bit, and I had to, be humbled. And I'd been doing this for more than 20 years, and I had all kind of different kind of tanks, and I had a lot of success. But then for the first time ever, I couldn't keep fish alive. So I almost had to go back to the beginning and sort of relearn everything I thought I knew, and just from a completely different approach. And it just kind of like has turned into an obsession for me to learn everything I can about fish diseases.
Now, do you find that gill flukes is a very common problem with new fish, or what is?
Sorry, say that again.
As I said, are gill flukes a very common cause for fish death when you first get a fish, or?
Yeah, it was strange. 20 years ago, I didn't even know what gill flukes were. I was familiar with ick and velvet, bacterial infections, lymphocystis, the more common diseases, but I had never heard of gill flukes. And now they just seems to be more and more rampant, especially in wrasses. For some reason, wrasses seem to be more susceptible to gill flukes. And the crazy thing is the easiest thing to see if a fish has flukes. If you put a fish and do a freshwater dip on a fish for 5 minutes, at around the 3 to 4 minute mark, you'll actually see these tiny white specks fall out of the fish, especially out of their gills. That's how you know a fish has gill flukes. But, I never knew that. And I learned that, and that's how I figured out what the problem was. And, I needed to treat with Prozi Pro, and I had to, kind of right the ship with the tank. Right.
So that's something that most hobbyists probably don't ever get the chance to really figure it out. They just feel, well, all of a sudden this fish died on me.
Yes. There's no symptoms, no visible physical symptoms. The fish will just, over 2 to 4 weeks will just die. And you never actually see anything on the body, on the fins, to actually figure out what happened. And that's what was racking my brain until I figured it out,
No heavy breathing or anything? Would that be a sign of gill flukes? Or just rapid gill movements? Or?
Well, yeah, there are behavioral symptoms. You would see a fish with gill flukes, they'll almost like they're yawning, heavy breathing. You'll see like they'll rub on the rocks and substrate, but they especially target their gill areas. But the thing is, with that, that could be an external parasite in their gills, or it could be flukes. That's the thing. Why you kind of have to then do the freshwater dip to, either confirm flukes or rule it out. Heavy breathing, scratching, yawning. They'll twitch their head, trying to dislodge the flukes from their gills. So there's all these behavioral symptoms, which could mean flukes, but they could also mean external parasites, like say ick is inside their gills as well.
Right. When you go to a pet store, what is something you look for when picking out a fish? Signs of fish being ill, or other things that you would think of? So a new hobbyist just going in, and I'm going to pick out this fish at the store. What do you want to look for fish illnesses or diseases you think would be best to look for?
Well, so the first thing you would look for is just obvious physical symptoms. Everyone knows, if you see white dots on the fish, that's obviously you don't want to buy that fish. That's a bad sign. Most likely, though, if a fish has ick or velvet, it's the white dots are usually going to start on the fins first. Also, another little trick, obviously, it's easier to see that on a dark colored fish than a yellow tang, a lightly colored fish. You have to look, kind of at an angle or at the side to see that on a lightly colored fish. But then a lot of times you'll buy a fish that actually has a disease, but there's no physical symptoms. So you then kind of have to start keying in on behavioral symptoms. And it's just like with flukes, if the fish is twitching its head, there's rubbing, yawning. A lot of fish that, for example, that have velvet, two things about marine velvet disease, which is probably the worst disease there is. Fish, makes them sensitive to light. So anytime you see a fish that's hiding a lot, staying out of the light, it's a possibility the fish could have velvet. Also, fish with velvet will swim into the flow of a powerhead because they're trying to use the flow to relieve their symptoms in their gills, because most worms, parasites, they start in the gills and then they sort of move their way outward. So anytime you see a fish like breathing heavy, something that seems to be bothering their gills, that's a bad sign. And I tell people, don't just look at the fish itself, but look at any of the fish's tank mates, because most diseases are waterborne, they are transmissible. And nowadays, most local fish shops, they'll tie all of their aquariums into a common sump, and there's a common return line. So because diseases are waterborne and they're transmissible, a fish could have ick 2 tanks over. But if all that water is all flowing together, then that disease you're going to have cross-contamination, and you're going to have a disease in another tank. So the fish you're looking at might be fine, but if a fish 2 tanks over isn't, and all the tanks are plumbed together, then there's a good possibility that fish is going to eventually have the same disease.
Right. I always look at fish in the whole system, because a lot of times you'll get a whole shipment.
Right.
And so you want to see what they've got, the whole shipment looks like, because they might have been exposed to the same water in the distributorship that they came from.
Exactly.
Because usually dealers most pet stores only deal with maybe 1 or 2 fish distributors or coral distributors. Mainly, they don't deal with a whole bunch of them. They'll just get 1 or 2 accounts, and then they'll just work off of that. So,
the shop I advise. He will get in every now and then a shipment with velvet, and it wipes everything out. Maybe you'll have, out of maybe 60 fish, you'll have maybe half a dozen survivors. So yeah, they definitely, like you're saying, they share water at the holding facility. They share water when they get to the local fish shop, and that's really the key. If they share water, it's just like a sick person being locked in the room with a dozen other people. If the virus or whatever they have goes airborne, everyone's going to get sick.
Like having when you have kids and they get sick, you get sick too.
Exactly.
Everybody's sick.
Oh yeah.
That's what signs when you're in your home aquarium, when we get them home and we're looking for in the QT. what signs would you recommend to watch for long term over a month's time of any kind of diseases cropping up or anything like that? Do you think there's anything that you need to just eating or watch if they're scraping?
Yeah, that would be the main thing. So you'd obviously look for if the fish is rubbing on rocks and substrate. So it's kind of like all the same things you look for in a fish shop before you buy it. Also flashing, if a fish is like darting suddenly in the water, that can, again, they're trying to relieve something in the gills. You look again for any kind of growth. And there's certain diseases that have like specific symptoms. Like a good example is intestinal parasites, which is, worms in their guts. So that a fish would have a shrunken stomach or actually white stringy feces. And if you see that, that's two symptoms of intestinal parasites. You treat with a medication called Metro, which is actually not reef safe, but you can actually, you can soak food with it and then use a binder like Chem Focus to hold the medication into the food so that makes it reef safe. And again, I'm a big fan of freshwater dips because a lot of times you don't know whether you're dealing with a worm or a parasite. And I like the freshwater dip because if you give the fish a freshwater dip, you don't see gill flukes. Then you can more target in on an external parasite like ick or velvet. I would say another thing that would be unusual. Obviously you put a new fish in your tank, it's going to hide for the first 2 or 3 days. But any fish that stays hidden for more than that, like a week, and you're not really seeing this fish come out, that's generally a bad sign. That generally means the fish just isn't feeling well. The fish might be being bullied, or the fish is light sensitive because the fish has velvet. So that's another thing to watch out for.
Yeah, I know what I always watch out for is bullying. Like as an example, on this tank, I have, you see two pajama cardinals in this tank.
Mm-hmm.
Most people would say, pajama cardinals, they're not very aggressive, but believe you me, these two guys here, one will just totally pick on this one over here, one at the upper. On this side here, the way he's staying over here, see how he's staying up in this corner? This guy over here picks on this guy like crazy. When he was in the smaller quarantine tank, I have a innovative marine defroster over here on my tank. I leave him there a lot for just this purpose. He would actually hide up next to it all the time, during the whole time. All day. He'd just be up in there, and as soon as I drop food in the defroster, he pops down, gets the food, and goes right back up. But now they kind of keep this distance right here.
You might have two males.
I might have. I can't tell. I'd have to get out to my boat and see. But I might have two males here, But they do. I had 3 of them, and one of them got picked to death.
Okay.
So this is what I've got going on this tank myself. So for other people, thinking pajama cardinals or cardinals themselves aren't very aggressive, I can tell you that these two guys here are pretty dang aggressive going on.
Yeah, I have two as well. I don't know if you can see them in that. It's the same issue. When they were in quarantine, they were fine, and now that I've moved them into this tank, so you're thinking quarantine in a smaller tank is where the aggression would arise. But once I put them in here, I've noticed one is chasing around the other, and I figure I'll probably have 2 males.
Yeah, but I don't know. I'd have to look up what would tell a male from a female. I haven't had a chance to do that. But at this right now, they're not really hurting each other. Because I worry about this fish over here all the time, being sick. But he's taking care of himself. When I get the food out there, if I'm feeding a frozen food or feed a pellet food, he'll go out and get his food, because I'll feed those little bitty blue arrow pellets. They love those things. But I'll drop one in at a time over their heads, and they'll get the food, they'll pop down and get it. So that's one thing I always find, and especially if you're trying to get 2 or 3 fish through one quarantine tank, is make sure you don't have aggression going on, and that can add a whole other layer to the fish disease problem,
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I mean, in quarantine, what I like to do is you've seen people how they use, I call them the PVC caves, the PVC elbows. And I find if each fish in quarantine has their own, their own PVC cave, it alleviates a lot of the aggression because they've got their own little nest, home, whatever. And as long as the other fish stays out of their cave and sticks to their cave, that does alleviate. I knew a guy one time, he had I want to say it was like a 26-gallon quarantine tank, and he must have had 20 fish in this thing. And he probably had about 10 or 15 these PVC elbows. I mean, they were actually stacked one on top of the other. And I mean, he was treating for ick, and he went fallow for 72 days, and he made it work.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. It's, we say quarantine, but I know a lot of people might not do a quarantine mainly because of the logistics of it all. You
Mm-hmm.
know, and that's, well, I want to put 10 fish in this tank, and I always say, take it slow. This is not a, this is not a short-term hobby. You want to take your time and put fish in there. Just buy one fish, and just deal with that one fish. Don't try to buy 10 fish and put it in your quarantine tank or in your tank itself. The best to go really slow,
Oh yeah, exactly. I mean, and it never ends. I mean, I think some people, they get like in their mind that, well, okay, this is my stocking list. But you know as well as I mean, you get to the finish line, and then there's another fish that you want, and I know people that will rehome fish, sell fish, trade fish. It's something that you're always looking for the next fish for your tank.
Right. I mean, I look at it as somebody's been keeping aquariums since I was 10 years old. I look at it as more of a long-term
Right.
thing. A new hobbyist that's their first time in the hobby, they want this perfect tank.
Right.
Like, you know, whereas this tank here has only been set up about 2 weeks, and I'm starting to deal with, some diatoms in here and things that I've got to mess with. And so I've had tanks set up so many times that I've always learned if you take it slow and fix the problems one at a time and not get a whole bunch of problems at once, which is what
Right.
people do. They get a lot of problems in one time, and then they can't handle it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, you get overwhelmed. Exactly.
And in the hobby. What would on acclimation of fish when you get a fish home? What is your recommendation on like dripping or floating the bag in the tank, doing water that way? What do you find that works best for you on acclimating the fish to the water at home and the salinity in your tank or in your quarantine tank?
Well, what I do is because I quarantine everything, so it's easy for me because most local fish shops are online suppliers. They keep their fish in lower salinity. I mean, I think most of the time it's between like 1.019 to 20, so that's kind of problematic if when you put a fish directly into your display tank because most of us keep our salinity I think around 1.025 to 26. And fish have a much easier time going down in salinity than they do going up. If they go up in salinity, then they can go into osmotic shock, even if you do a prolonged drip. So what I do is with my quarantine tank is I set the salinity to match the supplier. So like, for example, if I'm going to get a shipment of fish in from Live Aquaria, well, they typically keep their fish between 19 and 20. I set my quarantine tank to match that perfectly. When I get the fish, I just float the fish to temperature acclimate for about 30 to 45 minutes. Open the bag. I double check the specific gravity in the bag to be sure it matches my quarantine tank. And if it does that, I just add them right in. I'm not a big fan of drip acclimation, mostly because of the ammonia issues that can build up during a drip acclimation, especially if the fish has been in transit for a while. So I really prefer to float and release. But the only way you can really do that is by really utilizing a quarantine tank and matching the salinity. You float the bag, the temperature acclimate, and then just release the fish.
Right.
Um, And then once I get the fish in quarantine, you know, for the first 24 hours, I just leave the fish alone. I don't even turn on the light. I might feed a little, maybe, but I just kind of let the fish rest. And, you know, obviously they've, you know, had a long journey, especially if you order online. Let them relax, let them get settled into the quarantine tank. And then by the second day is when I start feeding. If I'm going to use medications, you know, I start all that then.
Mm-hmm. So you feel like it's best to get your quarantine tank set up to the temperature, to the salinity of the supplier is what's
Yes.
the best for what you want to do.
Yeah.
Most of the time, I buy a lot of my fish through the local pet stores. This is one of our local pet stores, Urban Ocean.
Okay.
And Urban Ocean's here. And so I just kind of work with whatever they have going on in their systems. I try to support the local fish stores that I can.
Right.
You know, in that case, a lot of times I just do a drip acclimation since that's not going to be that long a period of time, you know. And it's just.
And if you're going to do a drip acclimation, that's fine. But if the fish has been in transit for a while, I just tell people, you know, maybe take like a little squirt of Amquel or Prime or something to neutralize any ammonia that's in the water. That's the best thing to do with drip acclimation. But I mean, I've even found even fish, you know, that I've done like a 1.5, 2 hour drip acclimation. If there's a huge difference in salinity, I've noticed that fish, if I put them in quarantine and they seem to struggle for a few days with that. And that's kind of when I kind of started learning and reading about how fish can go into osmotic shock by going up in salinity. Whereas, so if you bought a fish that the source water was say 26 and you're putting them in 20, they handle that with no problem. You know, because, you know, people that do hyposalinity, they'll drop their salinity from like 26 down to 1.009 to do hyposalinity. They'll do that in like 24 hours, you know, for that treatment.
Do you find any fish more susceptible to problems and changes in salinity than others? Particular fish that have the problem of that, or like
butterflies? Definitely butterfly fish. They seem to be, I don't know what they're just the gentlest, and they seem they just seem to be the most sensitive to changing water chemistry. And they're the ones, whenever I'm dealing with butterfly fish, I'm the most careful. You know, kind of, you know, with kid gloves with them. They just seem to be very sensitive. Whereas opposed to like I found tangs and angels are not. You know, they seem to be, you know, easier to acclimate. But whenever I deal with butterfly fish, like especially like I've got a copper band in here, long-nosed butterfly, things like that, or maybe sensitive fish like a Moorish idol. I mean, I take every precaution to ensure it's a smooth ride for them.
Well, I mean, some fish you could, like a damselfish, you could drop on the floor and stick it back in the tank. That really is fine.
Yeah, actually, before the podcast, I actually was feeding this tank, and this yellow flanked wrasse actually jumped out of the tank. I was feeding, and I don't know if I actually hit him with the spoon. I was feeding live blackworms. He actually jumped out of the tank, jumped into my hand, and I threw him back in the tank. And like 5 minutes later, he's eating blackworms. You know, wasn't even phased by it. So yeah, wrasses are pretty tough too. They're pretty tough.
I used to have a Christmas wrasse years ago that he just loved. I used to have the old hang on the back wet dry filters on the back of the tank, and man, every morning I'd come in to check the tank, and he'd be laying there on the filter pad alive because water was just pouring over him. You know, I just pick him up and stick it back in the tank. You know, yeah. He was just always doing that type of shit.
Wrasses are tough. I don't know if it's their body shape or something, but yeah, they can hit the floor, they can jump all over the place, and they're tough fish.
Yeah, they're tough fish. So I'm glad that we had this talk, Bobby, and
yes.
It's been a great discussion on to get started on the Dr.Fish show, and I hope we'll get back with you soon, and we'll talk about other fish diseases and other problems that people have with their fish tank. So glad to see you.
Thank you, Ed.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye bye.